Why would you? All right. Howdy. So, thanks for coming. I appreciate it. So, my name is David McCartney. Application whitelisting. The pithy title of "Be careful where the silver bullet is aimed," because this stuff will shoot you at least in the foot, if not elsewhere, depending on how you do it. All right. A little bit about me, the professional blah blah stuff. Been doing IT for a while. Got a little bit of gray going on here. Spent some time in both healthcare, power industry, retail, and I'm currently working in education. I'm a senior analyst for Ohio State. I've got a master's degree in network security. CSP. And I'm the treasurer for the Central Ohio chapter of the ISC Squared, otherwise known as the Security MBA, which is the Security Masters of Beer Appreciation. And yeah, we're the drinking club with a security problem. So if y'all are in Central Ohio, I highly recommend you check it out. More interestingly, so I'm a percussionist, play board games and some role-playing games. Actually been doing Ingress and have some fellow Ingress players around, exactly, right? I won't name the faction for fear of getting shot. Trying to learn the banjo because I am from West Virginia originally. And yeah, kind of a semi-retired DEF CON goon. We'll see how it goes from there. All right, you know, the typical CYA. Obviously, my opinions only. Doesn't reflect Ohio State or anyone else I've worked for previously. This is all based on my experiences or some completely fictionalized stories I'll be telling at some point here in at the end of the talk. I'm not a QSA. I'm going to touch on a couple of issues with PCI. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer, and I feel like the last one's pretty obvious. All right, so application whitelisting. What is it? It's an yeah. In reality, what it is, it's a shim into the operating system to help control what can run, what can't run, and how applications can run. It's also pretty often a scapegoat for shoddy development. If people are writing crappy code and your application won't let them, throw memory exceptions, you'll get the blame. And it serves really well as a highlighter of both broken technical and non-technical processes. A lot of this talk is about how to try to establish the things in advance so that you actually don't run into a bunch of walls. That being said, what is it not? It's not antivirus. And because of that, your PADSS certification may not apply. Depends on how the software was actually certified. Particularly a lot of software around POSs are certified based around running an antivirus client. So while application whitelisting can be more secure and it's a better control, it still can invalidate the DSS certification. A lot of times, honestly, it's not well understood by InfoSec staff or non-InfoSec staff. It can be a confusing beast. Also, yeah, it's not quick to deploy. I don't care what the vendors tell you, and if anyone's here that says it is, they're lying. It's not the Holy Grail. It really isn't. I mean, it's got potential, but it's not going to make you walk on water. It is definitely not also the definitive answer to not patching. Just because you run whitelisting doesn't mean you can't stop patching. So if you're looking for an excuse to not patch, or if you're already not patching, this won't necessarily really help you out. So it's really not the silver bullet, again, depending on what marketing tells you. So have I used it? Well, yeah. My so-called whitelisting life in a retail environment in a previous employer was right around 10,000 systems. It's a restaurant chain, and it was an interesting experience where they were running Windows Embedded, 2008 R2, and then a couple different versions of POS Ready, depending on what they were doing. And the good part on that is that there were only 6 images because one for each kind of version of the operating system. But just because there were only 6 images, how many releases of each image there were? So if you take 6 images, and the way we were doing things, there were quarterly releases. So 6 images times 4 releases, And the way they deployed images was they wouldn't update all of the images for all of the places. They would just, for anything new and any break fix, the new systems would get the new image. So you ended up starting this rolling kind of, part of the machines would be on image A, part of them would be on image B, part of them would be on image C, and part of them would be on image D. But yet your policies for whitelisting, what do you allocate for? Do you allocate only for the current stuff? Or do you start opening it up more to allow for the legacy stuff as well? Because, an old image that's been upgraded may not be exactly the same as a new image that's fresh. Yeah. All right. So if you're still not scared, well, it's early. Typically, for a rollout, you've got to figure out, what do you want to test against? What do you actually want to build your policies against? You have to isolate these systems as much as possible. Like, completely and totally shut them off from anyone that can do anything stupid. Because these are going to be the systems that people are building policies against. What that's going to look like is you put the product in kind of a learning, chatty kind of 5-year-old mode that's just watching everything you do. And from there, it's learning all the activities that are appropriate, activities, the things that shouldn't be happening. And that's why isolation is really, really important. So then you want to have a good, competent QA and testing staff to actually do the daily operations on these things. And they're going to have to do that for a while, because no one day is probably going to capture the activities. And this applies to both retail or really anything that's going on. So servers, workstations, the same process pretty much applies. So they're going to do that, and you're going to wait. And then you're going to keep waiting, because it takes a while to kind of hammer out all of the different use cases. After a few weeks-ish, you're going to start to have policies based around the things that have been going on. And this is where, and I say this with a fair amount of seriousness, you've got to hope and pray that those labs really were isolated, and that they really did reflect production, that people were actually, that you were relying upon to do competent testing and policy development, were really doing the job they were supposed to be doing. Because if they don't treat the systems the way production is, your policies aren't going to be ready for when production happens. After that, you're going to start tuning the logging. So you know what's supposed to be happening. You want to get rid of the white noise before you actually turn the product on. And then you're going to start testing, and then you're going to wash, rinse, and repeat. And your goal really is to get as much white noise taken out of the logs before you go live. That being said, how long should this take? Vendors will tell you, and this is multiple vendors, I'm not throwing any particular one under the bus. They're saying 3 months for 2 to 3 images to be mostly kind of sort of ready for deployment. It's crap. It is what it is. It's going to take more time. It's going to. It's not going to take less time, and a lot of the time is going to depend upon how much staff is there to actually do it. If someone's only doing part-time work, it's going to take longer. If the vendor doesn't want to work with you, it's going to take a lot longer. And that's all the vendors, both operating system and any applications that are be running. They all have to be willing to work with you, or it's not going to go well. Obviously, there's a couple other pieces there that can help increase your luck. That being said, if you regularly change the images, you add new software to the images, or you start doing patching, you're never going to be done. It's never a set it and forget it thing. No matter what they say, it's not set it and forget it. Ever. So here's some things to ponder when you're doing application whitelisting. What are you trying to solve? Is this going to replace other controls? And if it is, who's going to be managing this control? Or is there going to be additional staffing requirements? Could this have stopped previous incident response events? And just because you think it can you actually test that? Can you run the product and really go and bang against it and see if not what the vendor said it's going to do, if it actually does it when the rubber hits the road? How is the product deployed? Is it installed through a centralized management system? Does it have to be baked into each, pushed out through SCCM or something? How's it going to be pushed out? How's it managed? because there's multiple different ways for management to occur, and it can make or break really the success depending on the complexity. So you've got centralized consoles like an EPO, Bit9's got their own. So there's different ways for it to actually happen. Some are still actually using flat files to help control the whitelisting. How is the solution updated? So once you've actually got the application whitelisting product deployed, how are you going to update it? Will it allow it to update itself? Or do you have to turn it off to even allow it to be updated? Which I can tell you is a real case scenario where, yeah, it won't let you touch the file system itself because it's that shim. And if you want to upgrade the product, you have to disable the product. Well, then if you disable the product, what happens if you haven't been patching just for that, even that little window? And this stuff really happens. And then you want to figure out how the applications themselves are actually going to be whitelisted. We'll touch on that more in a second here. You also really need to know how mature your processes are, from imaging, testing, and QA. You want to know how many images there are and how are they released. You don't want the 24 image scenario I talked about previously, if at all possible to avoid it. You want to know how the images are updated and how often are they updated, and then is it going to happen, like I said before, are they going to all be pushed out at once, or is it going to be a rolling cycle where you're going to have to allocate for multiple pieces? And you need to be really confident in the maturity of that QA and testing process. I mean, none of this is necessarily rocket science, but this is really where it matters. More things to consider. How are they going to tell you if something doesn't work? And how the user is going to feed back to you? And the real case scenario on this is, so on registers, a particular product provided the option where you could click and submit comments. Something didn't work. I was trying to launch a file. But on registers, you may not have a keyboard. So how are they going to give you feedback? How are you going to work around that process? You need to make sure that your support's aware of how to actually find all the requests and capture the appropriate information. Additionally, the same solution could require or relied upon a mail client. So even on like a back office type system, if you didn't have the mail client actually enabled and they tried to submit comments for you, it would accept the comments all day long. Thank you. Thanks for telling me the data. It's great. I'll send it off to you. And nothing would go anywhere because the mail client wasn't actually activated. So the user keeps thinking they're giving feedback. Nothing's actually occurring. And this really does happen. Something's going to break at some point. I mean, it's inevitable. You're really limiting what things are doing. It may function in unexpected ways. If that's the case, how's support going to bypass the product? Because at some point they're probably going to have to. They may have to put it in that observation sponge mode again to see what's going on live. How do they do that? In at least one product, and I think this applies to multiples, there is the option to do a command line bypass. You've got a single command line password, you log in, you authenticate, you put in the password, but there's actually no authentication there's no validation on users of who's actually doing the action. So it's one command line password for the entire organization or for the entire tree. So you have no way to actually figure out, unless you make some manual process of, oh no, you need to put a ticket number in as a comment or something. There's no accountability on that. So you also then have to be able to trust your help desk to not just break stuff and shut it off whenever they want. And if they can bypass it, how are you going to bypass it? Are you going to rely upon the centralized console? Are you going to have to go in and touch every machine? What are your support options if something goes bad and goes bad quickly? And then how are those bypasses logged? Again, if there's not authentication on who's actually doing it, how are you going to know who took the action? And where's the accountability on that? And this is a security product that's offering this functionality, or lack thereof. And also, obviously, if the good guys can bypass it, what about everyone else? Because if you've only got kind of one password to rule them all, and there's minimal logging and minimal accountability, how are you going to know when someone bad does something? And if someone does disable the product, be it on purpose because you tried to break something, something is broken, or someone maliciously has turned it off, what's going to happen if you haven't been patching? Suddenly you're completely exposed, pants down around the ankles, like there's just, you're hanging out, and there's nothing you can do because you haven't been patching. Hope you enjoyed the visual there. That being said, if you do everything perfectly, yeah, fortunately there are no weaknesses at that point. Except for a couple, I suppose. So you've got things like trusted directories, where if you're always allowing, for example, POS systems, you know it's always going to run out of a particular directory. So you want to trust everything that runs out of directory because you don't want to have to make exclusions or inclusions for just that. If you trust that directory and someone can actually get a hold of it, everything they do in there is going to be allowed just by default. Wildcarding. You know, it's a very meticulous process, so it's a lot easier at times to start wildcarding stuff. You know, POS 3000 star.star, or POS star.star, or star.star just without anything else on it. Additionally, you know, they offer the option for where you can provide a path, where you can allow, you know, a particular full executable to work. But if you aren't providing the hash for that, what happens if someone renames the executable? If they can get in there and through safe mode, and safe mode sometimes will still work with the application whitelisting, sometimes it won't. Sometimes it'll allow you to do stuff, and sometimes it won't. So it just depends on how secure your environment is, and you know, physical access controls especially. Also, let's say you rely upon certificates, so that, you know, the vendor is signing, and you're relying upon their signature, so everything they run should be wonderful, and you know, POS 3000 is, you know, signed by the vendor, and so everything they do. Well, what happens if they haven't used their certificates properly? Or what happens if they lose control of their certificates and it gets abused and taken on, and you've allowed the certificate to then run whatever it wants on the system? Additionally, what will happen here is it kind of ties into sharding inheritance, where, you know, process A can call process B calls process C generates a temp file. The first three processes may have been all signed by the vendor, but what about that temp file? Was that temp file generated with the signature? Or are you going to have to then do wildcard exclusions for the temp files that those processes actually put out? You got to figure out where the chain is actually going to break. There are a couple talks out there from last year that, you know, if you want to know more of the technical how to break it, Mubix and I can't remember who did the other one, but they're out there. Or look at Google. You can find it out. Q&A's at the end, sir. What's up? Go ahead.
As part of the force certificate usage, did you see, at least the technology you were working with, that they implemented good CRL implementation?
Yeah. So the question is, how was the revocation ability for bad certificates if you find something that's not working well? And the ones I worked with or looked at all handle that well. The assumption there, though, is that you're able to communicate, and you do have that centralized management, which goes back to that earlier point of how are you going to control things. If you're relying upon batch processes, or if you've got a large infrastructure and are, you know, not able to talk quickly, how can you stop something bad from breaking out pretty fast? Certainly. Thank you for the question. Here's some spots where I think whitelisting really can pay off. You've got legacy systems where AV is no longer working, and so you don't have another control, but you've still got to be running it. A lot of hospitals run 2000 or XP, or yeah, those are the frightening examples I can think of. AV may no longer be supported. In that case, you know, segment it off and drop whitelisting on it. Systems that don't change a lot, and that goes around what I've discussed before, where, you know, when you can set it and forget it and know what's happening and know the activity, it's a great chance. You know, deep freeze it, throw application whitelisting on it, you know, wash, rinse, and repeat, and you're good to go. And that you know, systems with dedicated functionality where things aren't going to change, like PAC systems or imaging systems, where you know what the functionality is, how it's going to be. You know, they're always going to write out to a certain directory. This executable is always going to do it. Those are perfect for whitelisting because it's always a predictable, established pattern. Systems with lightweight hardware, like gas pumps. There are several you know, vendors out there, you know, places that are using this there because it's a cheap-ish, lightweight control. It's a small footprint, so you know, a lot of the gas pumps nowadays are actually running some sort of a whitelisting in the background. And systems really where multiple controls can coexist. And that goes back to running AV. You can say what you will about AV, but running that in conjunction with with whitelisting, so that in the event something does get disabled, you've got something else to to cover yourself until you can get back up and running. And obviously systems where there's a tightly controlled, mature, wonderful rainbows and unicorns type process, which is kind of nirvana at this point. I don't have to say anything else there. Here's my lessons learned, and this is where hopefully I can give you all some real practical pieces. Obviously, like all security, you got to bake it in early. If you don't bake it in early, you're always trying to play catch up. And if you're always trying to play catch up, you're going to be frustrating people when the policies aren't ready. So get it in at the beginning. You want to make sure that everyone understands why you've got the technology and that they're on board with it. And everyone from executives to your support teams, from patching and help desk, any developers you've got, both for the vendors and internal developers, and the vendors you're working with. Because if you don't have all these people working together, they're all going to point at each other and say, no, it's your crap that's not, it's not working. It's your crap that's not working. We didn't certify this with whitelisting. Why? It's obviously you're doing something wrong. It happens. And the other big piece is the concept of source, which is pretty prominent in multiple products. And what that looks like is who's initiating the action. So what process is actually making calls? With whitelisting, you're not really able to start doing pushes anymore, because if you're trying to push and you allow something like Explorer to push to actually receive files, there's no way in whitelisting to control from an IP range. So if you allow Explorer to start receiving files, anyone that can get on that network and start pushing files out will be able to, the systems will start receiving it. So you have to start working on a much like a pull mentality, where if you want things to happen, you need to schedule batch processes for pulling and things like that. But you have to keep in mind, anything that's pushed out and any allocations you make, anyone that can get onto that network will then be able to start abusing those pieces. So that's where you want to be careful about the exclusions and exceptions that you make there. Obviously, you want to make sure your labs really reflect production. If they don't, when it goes live, it's going to fail. And fail badly. You want to test thoroughly and test often. You don't want to be the only tester. And one of the things that I mentioned, or I had up there previously, you're probably not the SME on every product that's out there. You can't be. People use it day in and day out, other applications. They need to be telling you if functionality is working or not working. You should not be expected to know the ins and outs of every system. You can't do it. They can. For PCI, what we ended up doing was actually, I had to audit the auditor's understanding of whitelisting, where you had to find out, were they willing to accept it as a compensating control? Because if they're not, you probably don't want to use that, the QSA, and find a different one. It happens, but you need to make sure that they actually really understand why you're doing it, they're on board with it, and if it's appropriately configured and it's offering a solid control, that it is acceptable. If not, switch QSAs. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with interviewing them in advance. It actually saved some heartache and headache. You want to make sure that your vendors are going to partner with you. If they don't partner with you, they're going to point fingers. If they point fingers, it's like everything else. Nothing productive is going to happen. And now for story time. These are completely fictional stories. I promise. Yeah, no vendors were harmed, much to my dismay. So let's say a vendor offers their own whitelisting solution, but you've chosen not to purchase it, due to licensing or whatever. So they've got their solution, you have yours, they don't want to support yours. So of course your whitelisting solution is going to be crap compared to the one that they have. Well, if they don't support your solution, every time something flakes out, it's because your solution is configured incorrectly. There are at least one POS vendor, who shall remain nameless, who had their own whitelisting option. You ask for a rule set, just for something to kind of start with, a basis for configuring your own rules. They had nothing to actually provide you. They had whitelisting, but they couldn't tell you how it was configured. So make sure you're talking to your vendors before you actually go down that route. Furthermore, as a result of that, if the powers that be, if they're not in your camp and if they're not supporting you from management, from executive level, the solution may get turned off. It may get turned off in a small sample set to make sure that, let's just validate to see maybe it is your control that's causing the problem. Again, if it gets disabled in a small set, sample area, and you haven't been patching, you're hanging out there. It's not a good place to be. If the vendor had cooperated on this particular situation, it could have gone way easier. But because they were annoyed that they weren't making the revenue, they made it a lot more difficult. It's my little culture club reference for the moment. Here's another theoretical, I just made this up kind of situation. So let's say your labs are really isolated, and all the activity does actually reflect what's happening in production. Then you wander around one day and you take a look, and you see them maybe, I don't know, with a USB drive inside the system, and you find out then, wait, the vendor's actually testing on those systems. New software, new functionality, because maybe they don't have enough labs, maybe they don't have enough equipment, maybe they're just lazy, and you're basing your policies around the activity that are happening in these labs. So you've now allowed USB access as part of your default policy because they didn't truly isolate it, which means when you go to roll it out, if you haven't pulled that piece out, anyone that wants to walk up with a thumb drive now has the activity actually authorized. You've got to make sure they really, really are isolated, that they really reflect production. All right. It's for my Canadian assistant. Thanks to Mick Douglas, who helped me out a lot during this, and as well as James Arlen. They were great sounding boards. They both helped me out with the abstract and the presentation, and I appreciated both of their time. If you want to ask more about this, because you may have questions, you may want to copy the slides. I'm happy to talk about it. Here's how you can reach out. Got multiple ways. Twitter stuff, I wouldn't talk about it probably there because it can get pretty sensitive. But please, if you have questions, reach out. I'm happy to talk about it really at any point. If you want to talk about it while we're here, there's my ransom demands, I guess. So that being said, do people have questions? Yes.
So you said that a lot of times you have to move into a pull mentality where you're pulling down updates. If you're doing pull updates, how do you, if something goes sideways, how do you undo?
You've got to make sure that you've got the fails. Sorry. So the gentleman in the front row who may have assisted with helping out with this initially, asked about, if the pull mentality goes south, what do you do? How do you work around it? And that's where you've got to rely upon them to have had fail-safes built in. There's nothing wrong necessarily with a short-term disable or a short-term kind of bypass mode, but it starts to become habit then. Whenever something craps out, we'll just put it in bypass. No, it should be 5 minutes, 10 minutes. 10 months, it becomes the default activity. And that's where that auditing really comes in handy of who's doing the activity. Because if there is no accountability, they'll just throw it in bypass anytime. Because why wouldn't they? You don't know who did it. How are you going to know? So that's hope for fail-safes built into the process. Push comes to shove, you can try to bypass short-term, but that's a dangerous thing to rely on a regular basis. In retrospect, I probably wouldn't have recommended the help desk actually have access to the ability to unlock the CLI, to then do it. It would have meant more pain and suffering for whoever's actually supporting the app, which was me. But at the same point in time, then there's a much more controlled area as to who's actually able to modify things.
So you've seen a shift from responding to malware and your use is actually just doing more whitelisting of applications that are legitimate, weren't part of your original policy?
Yeah. So the question is, do I see a shift from malware to more whitelisting applications that weren't part of the original policy? And it's going to happen. I mean, no, it doesn't matter how much you test and how long you test it. You're going to miss things. There may be a process that happens twice a year, daylight savings time, for example, where, if you don't catch that, because that wasn't, part of the trigger process when you were actually doing your policy, you're going to miss it. And so then you're going to have to modify it and redo it. They may want to introduce additional functionality that wasn't originally there. They like something, they want to add more onto it. Things like mobile ordering, on a POS environment, has become much more popular. So if that wasn't part of the base functionality initially, you're going to have to then modify your policy to allow for that and all the pieces that go with it. Sorry. Path-based, yeah. So I touched on it. The question is path-based file listing. You can do path-based. There's a risk, obviously, there where if you allow for a certain directory, and let's say you've allowed for the entire directory, or directories underneath that, you can run into the risk of when bypasses happen, and then someone can actually drop a file into that particular directory and take over, or start performing siphoning of some sort. So that's you really want to hash as much as you can, but it's a pain. It's time consuming, it's difficult. It was 90% of my job, and it wasn't the fun 90% by any stretch. So right. So if you're able to control the actual user directories themselves on that, it depends on how you're able to lock down the workstation. There are certain vendors, and this is going to obviously depend upon your environment, but some software actually requires local admin access no matter what you do, so that the vendor, let's say you put the directory to your back office software, but that has to be able to be run as an administrator. You could start playing with controls a little bit. You have to be careful not to, lock it down so much that they can't do the functionality they want. It's possible if you can get vendor cooperation for it. Will they support that functionality? Will they allow for that to actually occur? And are you going to have to actually make the business case for it to even be explored? So that's where vendor compatibility really is important. So. Yes.
So with the products you evaluated, and I'm assuming there's one that you may or may not have mentioned the name of. I haven't had experience with them. I'm just curious if that application had the use of pre-built hash lists in addition to their own, whether they're using like this, whether they're using Microsoft, Adobe.
So the question is basically, are there kind of predefined feeds where you can actually make whitelisting go a little bit faster? And yeah, they're the ones I looked at, because there were multiple, offer that functionality, which is great kind of for your base operating system. It's then when you start getting the actual customized apps or stuff that's being developed in-house that you then have to make sure that you've got the time for. So yeah, I think that's pretty standard functionality now, from both a whitelisting and then locking perspective as well. So. Symantec, McAfee, when it was initially Solid Core, then McAfee purchased them, and Bit9 were the three I took a look at. pretty extensively.
What's the semantic?
Hell. Yeah, it's been. I'll talk offline about it, but I don't want to throw anyone under the bus. The challenge with Bit9 at the time was they actually didn't have memory management, so they weren't able to prevent buffer overflows and things like that from occurring and taking care of it. They've since addressed that, but at the time that was the kind of one of the deciding factors. So, yes, sir.
So it's kind of a two-part question. So it seems like there's a lot of pitfalls with whitelisting and a lot of uphill battles to kind of get it tuned and the way you want it. So the first part's really kind of what things can an organization do to kind of, when do you know you're at a maturity level for whitelisting? Is there something that should be done sort of if that's in depth before you do whitelisting that you recommend first? And then, sort of the second part is, how do you know when you've reached success, knowing that there's ongoing, tuning that has to happen? Your management wants to see an ROI, on the investment. What's the success criteria for that? So, sorry, it's being long-winded.
Sure. So, yeah, you'll have to bounce the second one off me in a second. But so the first part of the question is, how do you know when you've got the maturity to actually even start looking at it? And I think you need to look at the processes I talked about around your QA, around your deployment. That if you don't have those pieces in place first, and you're trying to develop them as you're doing this application whitelisting solution, you're probably doing it in the wrong order, because you're setting yourself up to fail again if you don't have a good way to test, if you don't have documented testing or automated testing of some sort, if you aren't able to provide the isolation in the labs, because you're relying upon that so heavily, if you don't have a thorough QA process. And I really think, in retrospect, probably contract language should have been done with the vendor that we used to either require support or require an understanding that this is what we're, the chosen direction, and you either work with us or we'll find something else. With 10,000 licenses, you've got some weight there, I feel like, and I don't think we used it properly. So, and the second part is, success criteria. Yeah, and it's going to depend on what you're trying to accomplish, which goes back to that kind of previous piece of, what's the space around incidents that you're trying to stop in the future. It's really flexible. As to what you're trying to do. Is it going to be a percentage-based deployment? Is it the fact that you're going to have all of the systems, 75% of the systems running in kind of an enabled mode? Is that your success criteria? Realizing there's always going to be, something breaking somewhere. So you've got different ways to look at it. Are you going to use it on servers? Is that, are you going to run on the back end, and percentage of deployment? Then again there, and active deployment, like actually enabled. I've heard tales of a company where you could have the software deployed and it was there, but it wasn't actually running. I've heard of companies where this can occur, multiple companies, where the software's not running. The auditor, and this is again why you want to audit your auditor, if they don't know any better, compliance isn't security, but you've really shot yourself in the foot and may end up in the news, some sort of a targeted depot style attack. So.
Can you talk a little about patch update cycle on existing workstations or in your deployment, where things kind of close it once they were deployed out on a given image route?
So the question is about the patch cycle and how that worked with kind of freezing images. The approach that we took was a quarterly deployment, and then you would do as much as possible monthly updates on those quarterly deployed images. Yes, you burn them and then re-image and then deploy that to your depot, and then your depot goes out and does your break fix. The big down point there, and again, I think it's process, and this may go back to what you were asking. If you can't push out that new image every time you're gone, the exclusions and the adaptions you're going to have to make by having multiple iterations of that image floating out there, it's going to get sloppy, and you're going to leave yourself wide open more often. We did not reimage on a quarterly basis. There was a gold image made on a quarterly basis that only went out to the new systems. So
the old ones remained as they were locked down.
Yes, but they would receive patches.
Oh.
So we would push out patches, and then at the same point in time, that gold image was getting updated on a quarterly basis. But this gold image may not look exactly like this patched workstation, depending on how a fresh, clean install versus an upgrade. So then you've still got multiple iterations going on, and how do you adapt policy for that?
So then my question is about so let's assume an existing image that you're pushing patches to for that quarter.
Mm-hmm.
And so products, I understand, have a couple different ways to handle that. There's either a notion of a update window allow changes within this time frame, or you have the software publishers like or whatever. And which approach do you choose?
Some of each, depending on what we were actually trying to update at the time. The challenge we ran into, we were a Altera shop, Symantec Altera shop, and this isn't specific to Alteris, but the challenge we ran into pretty often was kernel level patching that would occur. If the operating system is being protected by the whitelisting, and it's really blocking it out, it doesn't matter how many allocations you actually make. At some point in time, it's not going to allow you to write, under that kernel level. So then you've got to figure out how you're going to address that, and that was a pretty regular issue. Or you'd end up with just a random driver that was always loaded. That to get refreshed, you had to reboot the system. But if you couldn't let go of the driver to actually ever let it get refreshed, again, until you actually disabled it, you weren't able to go any further. Patching has pros and cons. I think you need to do it, but I think you need to make sure that the vendor buys into how you're doing it. All of the vendors. I mean, your patching vendor, Symantec, it wasn't their product for endpoint protection, which would help eliminate kind of who didn't use. And because it wasn't their product, again, it's your product. Your product's just broken. I don't know why your processes won't work. Sorry.
So, since the red teams have been focusing on how to attack these things, like the living off the land and how is the new black, it's getting harder and harder to lock everything down appropriately with whitelisting and still have a functioning OS.
Yes.
Do you foresee a time in which this is going to just be more trouble than it's worth? That the bad guys can still overcome it, and it's got so much expense associated with it?
So the question is, do I think is the ROI versus the headache factor? Is it worth it? Is it really worth it? And I think it depends on where you're deploying it. That's where I think there's value, especially in the legacy systems or those non-moving targets, or the ones that have been wounded or are moving slowly, where there's not a lot of change occurring. When you allow for the rapid changes, or when you have to, you're deploying a new product, so you always have to be able to push stuff out. That's probably not the time to go for whitelisting, because you're going to be changing things all the time, and it, like you said, the operating system is consistently getting attacked on a regular basis by red teams. So if you lock it down super tight, it may not work properly. Things may not work. But if you don't lock it down tight enough, red teams are going to get in. Right. That's why I'm not necessarily convinced, unless it has to be, that it should be a singular control. I think that's where you use it maybe in conjunction with something else. Not that any one thing is going to actually stop it, but the more pieces you can introduce to stop malicious stuff from getting into the area, the better off you are.
Say the J word. Java.
I don't drink coffee, so
PowerShell.
yes.
Or did that come up during?
It did. And there was a lot of, PowerShell isn't a spectacular tool. It's great to be able to use from an administration standpoint and things like that. But again, whatever you allow to occur, depending on how granular you are, makes or breaks success. Same thing, with Java, where there's only so much control you can actually put in on what's being called and how it's being called. And hashing can get difficult on that, just because of how the calls actually occur. So,
Do tools have any notion of being able to deal with what the Java VM run? Or
it was.
Have Java allowed, and then you just kind of screw.
Yes, yeah. Because it's difficult to get that granular outside of using whitelisting. So then to try to actually specify, the exact controls of what's actually going to occur around that, it's hard. And you don't want to say, no, you can't use PowerShell because it's a really valuable tool. But if you allow PowerShell, that's where I think the concept of source that I was talking about, of who's actually initiating the action, starts to occur. If you can allow something to occur locally, but not to occur from a network transaction, run your PowerShell commands, dump something out into a flat file, then push that flat file out. But then you're not actually allowing PowerShell calls, depending on how you segmented and controlled, you're not allowing PowerShell calls to occur over the network or from a remote source actually initiating things. It's occurring at the local piece and then depositing the data elsewhere.
Do the whitelisting tools have any policy over it?
Not from what I saw. I won't say that they won't, but yeah, but from what I saw and the three I mentioned, there was not that.
It remains a whole.
Yeah, if you're going to.
The problem at whitelisting doesn't solve.
Right. If you're going to allow it, then you've got to allow it for everything. And I think there's also some lack of maturity in the whitelisting space, where maybe in a couple of years things will look different. But at that point in time, maybe you should hold off until then, or move slowly and cautiously, and really factor in those things of that I talked about before you start jumping off the cliff. So, anyone else? Again, bourbon, cider, if you see me. I'm 6'3", I'm bald, and easy to spot. So I appreciate y'all coming. Thank you very much.